Hi there. I'm really glad you decided to watch this video of Ele Chenier talking about their report on radical inclusion and how this work relates to our themes of resilience and anti-fragility. I'm Diane Feingood, the host for this conversation, but I forgot to turn on the record button before I introduced Elle. So here's what I said about Elle. Elle is a professor in the Department of History at Simon Fraser University. Elle also serves as president of Academic Women at SFU and director of the Archive of Lesbian Oral Testimony. When I introduce people, I really like to find a couple of things written about them. So here's what I found about Elle. They are committed to mindful and compassionate leadership. Elle also seeks a deep understanding of how we exist in relationship to one another, the necessity of having an open heart, and a willingness to be challenged and to change. I hope you find value in listening to my conversation with Elle.
First, thank you so much for inviting me. This is just, it's really great to be a part of this group. You're doing such important things. I wanted to also acknowledge the territory that I'm on, which is the St. Lawrence Iroquoian, the Mohawk, and the Longhouse Confederacy. You may know it as Montreal. So that's where I am. I am here helping to take care of my 4-year-old grandson. So spent the morning getting tattoos drawn on, because I have a tattoo on my arm. So he likes it when I draw this tattoo on him. And then he had to draw more things on me. So anyways, that was my morning here. But I'm really excited to be here with you. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about how the consultation came about, and then I'll just let you know when to throw up the slides when I get to it. So those of you from SFU will perhaps recall that a couple of years ago, SFU decided to undertake an equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm just going to from now on call that EDI. Some people say DEI. Anyway, so EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion initiative. As we sort of waited for this thing to unfold, and nothing was really happening. So I decided that why not, let's just do one ourselves. Let's initiate a consultation ourselves amongst faculty. So Academic Women represents female faculty at SFU. So we have over 400 members. And so I approached the provost at the time and I said, could you give us some funding for this? And he said, absolutely. And so we got the funding we needed and off we went. And we undertook this process last spring. And I wish I had an hour to tell you all about it, but you can read it, you can read it. But I am an oral historian, so which means, my work is interviewing people. So I have a lot of experience interviewing people, but relevant to this story, which I'm happy to answer in the Q&A later, but I won't get into it too much, is I've become a Buddhist in the past 5 years. So when I talk to you later about deep listening, this is a practice that's not just comes from oral history. In fact, I would say it doesn't come from oral history at all. Oral history is a certain kind of listening, but the kind of listening I've learned through Buddhism is truly deep listening, and the principles that I lay out in this report are really based on that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But anyway, so we wanted to undertake this report ourselves. So we held a series of consultations with our members, so it was exclusively with our members, and I talked to over 70 women. And one point of fact that I'll say that I think is very revealing is we held a series of consultations. They were closed and everybody could give their input anonymously. More women reached out to me independently for a one-on-one meeting than would come to those closed meetings. And the reason why I raise that, and the reason why that's so important is it's related to another point. The only woman who was willing to have her name used is retired. So what does that say to you about the state of EDI at SFU, that women, including full professors, were not comfortable having their name used in talking about their own experiences of sexism, racism, ableism, and so on? Like to me, that says everything you need to know about the climate, right? You can't even talk about it. So it was overwhelming, that experience, to listen to women who felt unseen, unheard, and unrecognized. It was, yeah, I mean, the story, so I would say one of the benefits of being an oral historian is that I tell the stories in the report. I let them speak for themselves because they're very, very powerful stories. And another point I want to make is the experience of racialized women is so deeply and profoundly different from the experiences of white women like myself. And I am just, when we talk later about resilience and anti-fragility, I am in awe of what women of color, Black women, and Indigenous women continue to endure on a daily basis. It's to be honest, it's quite shocking and disturbing. So you can throw up the slides now, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. The report, the first slide is an image of the front cover of the report. And then I just wanted to acknowledge whose work I built on here. So Wendy Harbour came to SFU and she talked about radical inclusion. And so all those images there are from her concept of radical inclusion that I'll explain. And then I also, for an ethic of care, which is another principle, that comes from the work of Colleen Shepherd, who's actually incidentally at McGill. I've never met her, but her book, this book, Inclusive Equality, is quite extraordinary. And that really is the foundation on which this work is built. And then I also want to recognize the work of Melinda Smith, who's just really out there in terms of addressing these issues in Canadian universities in particular, doing extraordinary work. Can you go to the next slide? So these are the slides from Wendy. So there you have exclusion, right? Segregation, integration, and inclusion. And what I want to say is, having looked at SFU, I would say we are still in integration. We are not even in inclusion yet. So if you can go to the next slide. So when Wendy Harbour, when she talked about radical inclusion, this final slide, the point that she's making is that when we look at these slides, we look at the people, right? So the gray people are white folks, or people who have power. Yeah, white folks, mostly men, but increasingly women. And then other people, right? So what she says is, what we're looking at the people, but actually what we need to pay attention to is the structure, and the structure is the circle. So radical inclusion means the structure itself has to change. And naturally, as you can imagine, having written this report, I've been spending a lot of time looking at this image to the point where now it looks like Mickey Mouse lost one ear. But I would actually change this even more. To me, that structure has not changed nearly enough. Not only is this most of the circle intact, but it's not porous. So I'm going to create a new, and talk to Wendy about it because this is her work. But I think it needs to have openings so it can be porous, and the shape needs to really change too. Was that the last slide, or was there any after that?
Nope,
okay, yeah. So we can end there. So now I'm going to show you a little fun thing that I have. Oops, which is here. So these are the three principles. I just want to put them up so you can. And I'm going to tell one story, and then we'll go to the questions that you have, Diane. So the foundations, so I started out wanting to make an argument that we needed a vice president equity. This argument has already been made. It had been rejected. And my concern was that this EDI process was going to happen, and they were going to, not accept this recommendation of a VP equity. So really what I wanted to do is provide evidence to show this is what we need in an argument. But I ended up in a very different place. So I still believe we need an EP equity, absolutely, but we need so much more. That's what I learned. And so the argument that I make in the report, and what I'm here to tell you about, is this idea of deep listening, an ethic of care, and solidarity politics. And the best way for me to explain this to you is to tell you a story. And it's a story I tell in the report. So you might also remember a few years back, when we had a liberal government, they required universities and colleges to develop a freestanding sexual assault policy. So that means it couldn't be a policy that came under student behavior, right? Regulating student behavior. Had to be freestanding, its own policy. So our vice president academic at the time was John Driver. And in fact, he still is right now. So he, straight, cisgender, white man, he spearheaded that project because it came under his wheelhouse. And we ended up they had an open consultation process. And in the end, we got everything we had asked for. We had asked for an independent sexual violence center that was well-resourced, well-staffed, produced statistics of how many people were coming to see them and the work they were doing, and also did education and outreach. And we got everything. And you never get everything. You never get everything. So I was doing research on the history of sexual violence policy at SFU. And so there was a brief period of time where he was not vice president academic. So I interviewed him because I'm an oral historian. And he explained to me what happened is his term as vice president academic came to an end, but the policy process was still ongoing. So he was asked, would you stay with it to see this policy to the end? And he said, okay, I will. But because he was no longer vice president academic, he suddenly had all kinds of time. To quote him, it was the fall. Normally, I would be overwhelmed with the budget. But he didn't have that to do. So what did he do? He went to sit in on the open community consultations, and he listened. He listened to the stories that people in the community came to tell. Now, he had been hearing those stories the whole time. He had his own people there taking notes, and they would give him notes. But he told me, sitting there and listening to those stories myself, it was something else completely. And I said to him, I felt like, I didn't know John well at the time, and I still don't know him. And I said to him, though, you watch people, right? Because you have meetings with them. And I said, I feel like you changed through that. And he said, absolutely, he changed through that. And it was that process of listening. So if you really listen to people, the rest follows. Everything else, the ethic of care and solidarity politics, they just happened because once he was listening, he was shocked at what he learned. And he cared so deeply. He stood in solidarity with us. And because he's a leader with power, he was able to give us what we wanted. It was, it was a thing of beauty. It truly was a thing of beauty. So that's my argument here. That's what I came to see. That's what became so clear to me, is that we need to start with deep listening. And through that, we can't help but care if we're truly listening. And once we care, genuinely care, we are in solidarity. And there's just one thing I always like to say to make it clear, is that this is ground up, it's not even ground up, it's work at every level, but the leadership always remains responsible. This does not absolve the leadership of being held accountable for equity, diversity, inclusion, and everything else. It absolutely does not absolve them, but it gives us but it's what it says. And what I learned is you can't just put in a VP equity and think my work is done. It's way more than that. So that's basically it.
Well, it's just the beginning, I think, actually. It's a good introduction, so thank you. I'm going to go back first to the diagram, because I have a question about the diagram and the difference between inclusion and radical inclusion, and how the heuristic of the diagram actually helps us. And maybe I should put it back up.
Sure.
I will do that because it can be helpful to sort of have this in front of us. Let me just get it to full screen. So I thought it was interesting that that the difference was the ear of Mickey, if you will, and that and I started to wonder, does that mean that we're talking about including a population instead of individuals? right? Because in the inclusion one, and you're right, even in the inclusion one, how do those people get there? It doesn't illustrate that. Here it suggests we might be welcoming in a larger population of individuals who we want to have as part of our institution. So I'm sort of curious about whether that's behind this distinction between inclusion and radical inclusion as well, or is it really simply to evoke the notion that we need a structural solution? What's your sense of that, Elle?
Well, okay, I'm gonna, if I can, I'm gonna show this cartoon. I was kind of queued it up for a little something different, but so maybe if you can make me big again there. Yeah, so this is a cartoon. I can't remember if it was Wendy who shared it with me, Wendy Harbour, the person whose radical inclusion idea it is. But so this is the concept of retrofitting and structural change, like in a way that we understand. So you put in, oh, you have someone in a wheelchair, let's put in a ramp. So the structure doesn't change, but what this also illustrates is the mentality doesn't change, right? He's doing the stairs first. And he doesn't grasp that if you do the ramp, then everybody can come.
Mm-hmm.
But to him, the stairs remain normative. So even though the ramp is there, there's still the normative gets served first and everybody else is an add-on. So the inclusion model, I think, is you got the add-ons. So they're not excluded, right? They're not integrated. Well, I would say that still is, that's just integrated because they're there, but we still work from the normative center, right? Which is, you know, not just able-bodied and racialized, but also sexualized and gendered, right? So it's heteronormative as well. And then of course we can also think about class structures, but I didn't really do that kind of work in this because it was talking all about female faculty. So we can assume we're all more or less of the same class, even if we have a different class background. So yeah, so structural change, to me, you can build the ramp, but you have to change the mindset, mm-hmm. right? So what that cartoon illustrates is the mindset hasn't changed. So it's very much the add-on approach. So another story that I have, and I want to be clear that a lot of this story, well, so I wouldn't have seen what I saw 3 years ago. I'm on a very prestigious journal board, editorial board, and the outgoing editor, which is white dominant, and as is the journal, as is the field that it, you know, publishes. Of course, one follows the other. So the editor is on their way out, and they said, let's use this as an opportunity to reach out and diversify the board. And of course, everybody's like, you know, great, good idea. And so the editor writes an ad like, we really, you know, and it was one of your very typical, we encourage people of color, Black and Indigenous people. And everybody's like, great, this is awesome. And to me, to me, I guess 5 years ago, I would have been like, yeah, that's fine. Sounds good to me, right? We're woke. We're aware we need to make this change we're doing. But now it's so clear to me that all that benefits white people. All that does is benefits white people because we're saying, look, we're not racist. We have people of color here. We've done nothing to tell a person of color why it would be a benefit to them to be on our board. Like, I want to say to white women, like, if a group of men said that to you, it would be so transparent that they just want, even if they didn't say, although men often do say we need a woman on this panel, but even if they didn't say that, you can tell when they want you for your expertise or they want you because you're a woman. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is that the folks, you know, good people that they are, because I was one of them, so I'm talking about myself, like totally just don't even see how offensive that is because we assume the benefit to them. But in fact, we're inviting them into a racist organization. We are racist. We are. So structural change happens. It has to happen in here, in the way we see as well. So inclusion, what we think inclusion is really just integration, and really is still actually segregation. In fact, I would say it's even still segregation. So if you look at how people of color occupy space and white people occupy space at SFU, it's segregated. It's a segregated space, you know? I know you have other questions, so, but one last story I'll tell that I think that really illustrates this to me is we had, Robin DiAngelo, the faculty of education brought Robin DiAngelo, who wrote that great book, White Fragility, come and give a talk. And as I sat there and looked at the audience, I never knew there were so many people of color at SFU until that day. So how stunning is it that people of color are at least 50%, if not the majority of the audience, for someone who's talking to white people about their racism? Like, there's so many layers of things in that we just need to unpack all of it, right? So so to me, that says we're we're still segregated. We're not even at inclusion yet, but we think we're inclusive, right? We think we are. So when we talk about that structural change, that's my short answer. Do you want the long answer?
Well, you're addressing kind of the second question, which was about what does radical inclusion actually look like in a
Right.
university or a community. So you've given us some good examples about what inclusion looks like, or what segregation or integration look like. But I'm trying to help. I'm always wanting to be toward thinking about the future and what is it we want ourselves to look like if we're a radically inclusive institution, be it the university, or for those who might not be in a university, an organization, another organizational structure. What are those things on the ground that we'll look at and go, yes, we're not just inclusive, we're radically inclusive. So if you've got a few examples, that would be great.
Right. So I can only speak about as a queer person who has lived most of my life as a woman. And I would still say I still live as a woman because that's how I'm perceived in the world, which is fine. I can talk about what that looks like, but I have no idea what it would look like to be inclusive of people with disabilities or people of color, because that's not my experience. And I don't know enough about that experience to even have an inkling, right? But like, I don't know if there was a tweet, I think, that went around just the other day that was, if there were no men on earth for 24 hours, what would you do? I mean, this takes me back to my early feminism days, and women were saying things like, I'd ride around on my bike at night and not be afraid, right? Like, so what does that mean? Do you have any idea what it's like to walk through a space and not be afraid? Like, women we don't, because you may never have been assaulted in your life, but you live knowing the possibility is always there for that to occur. And so there's a way in which you hold your body. And I became aware of that when I was in my 20s and went to the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which is a space only for women. And I couldn't believe the transformation in just how I walked. Like, it was extraordinary. And so it made me realize, I walked like my whole life just kind of waiting for it, So it would mean to walk through a space truly free. Like, can you imagine? I can't even imagine what that's like.
Well, I can only imagine it from the same perspective that you have, which is I went to MishFest at least 8 times, and it became for me towards the end of its lifespan like a critical element of reminding myself that there is another way to be in this world, and we can even create it for a week at a time. And it became my spiritual renewal personally in a year, in part because of the fear of walking around. But for me, it was actually more about how I appear in the world as obese. And the fact that I could go to that space and walk around, half clothed if I chose, and not feel uncomfortable, not be uncomfortable in that space. And that's the only time that I could ever do that. And when I was living in Edmonton and we came back from MishFest, and I was living in Old Strathcona and the Edmonton Fringe was on, I could barely go out of the house to be in sort of a mixed space like that, a regular public space. So I only share it in that way. But let me just push us a little bit into the idea of radical inclusion and resilience or anti-fragility. And I won't push too hard there, but I'll see whether you've been thinking about it. I know, and I'm curious to know what you've thought up, and then I'll invite others into to talk with us as well. So, have you got some thoughts about how radical inclusion helps to make us, or could help to make us resilient and anti-fragile?
Yes. So, I mean, so there's a few things. I think one of the metaphors I just want to share with everybody, because I think so. I asked my group, the breakout group we had, I said, oh, what does it mean to you? And we ended up talking about that. So my apologies for stealing it away, because I just wanted to see what other people's sense of it was. And there's a story that's often told in Buddhist teachings about in Japan. There's a name for this practice, and I can't remember what it is. But when a pottery bowl breaks, maybe it's not just bowls, but anyways, a pottery object breaks, they put it together using gold. And so the idea is that after it's broken, the object becomes more beautiful. And this is a very important principle in Buddhism. So, and a lot of people in the West, like myself, came to Buddhism because they were broken. Something happened in their life that caused a crisis. So that's why I went. And I was surprised. I'm not anymore, but I was surprised to discover so many other people had very similar experiences. So the practice of deep listening in Buddhism, what I learned is it begins with yourself, and you have to stop and listen to your own heart. And I have to tell you, when you did that introduction of me, I was like, I cannot believe that is an introduction that would apply to me, because I was a tough cookie my whole life. It's kind of like this about life, and so I've shifted, and I'm still, it's still funny to hear those words applied to me, but so I still feel self-conscious when I talk about the heart and feeling the heart, especially as an intellectual, right? As a scholar, we don't like that language, but yeah, you have to understand your own needs, and you have to begin to meet your own needs before you can truly be open and deep listen to other people. Because if your needs are there, either telling you negative things about yourself, it's going to be a filter on how you hear other people. And I am so much more resistant, and I am anti-fragile because of that work. Because I'm able to, my big thing was being reactive. I tended to be a very reactive person. And now I'm not very reactive at all anymore, because I'm able, there's a lot of space between me and what's happening, and a lot more compassion and understanding of stuff. Doesn't always make it easier to deal with, but I'm much more resilient and much more anti-fragile. So I really do think, so yes, there's a convergence of both my scholarly practices and then my own, as I was saying at the beginning, my Buddhist practices in coming to this position about what radical inclusion not can be, I think, but must be, what we must do in order to become radically inclusive, Yeah.
So much of what you just said resonates with me. And I think with a little bit of sadness that it's taken me 60 years to get to be able to deeply listen to myself. Like, that's an awfully long time. So for the young people out there, please don't take 60 years to get there. But it's also interesting to reflect on the nature of the Academy, and the fact that the Academy is part of why it took me 60 years to get to this place. It reinforces those notions of inadequacy and not deep listening about where you're, what you like to do, what you're good at, all of those things. And it really, for me, wasn't until I went away from the university for 5 years and came back to a place and a time when, I'm old enough, I'm tenured enough, I don't really care what other people think about what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. And it took being able to be in that space to feel free enough to start listening to the other things that were happening, about how much I was caught up in but I didn't get that award, or, those kinds of things that the Academy can do to us. So, thank you for taking the time to listen to my conversation with Ele Chenier, President of Academic Women at Simon Fraser University. If you found the conversation useful and inspiring, please pass on the link to this video to others who might be interested. And if you'd like to engage with our guests and in dialogues of relevance to COVID-19, please join our Community Resilience Network. Everyone's welcome to join. Thank you. Bye for now.